Well, in a low interest rate environment, the question arises, is it best to rent or is it best to pursue ownership of a property that you might live in? Let's talk about the issue of rent or own. Gavin Martin, the founder of Cornerstone Wealth, back with us again today. Hello, Gavin. Welcome back to 2020.
G'day, Neil. Nice to be with you again.
Gavin, we always like the low interest rate environment. That's the encouragement, isn't it, to borrow, to buy property, and just interested in your insights today on this whole debate over rent or own. What are you thinking at this particular time?
Yeah, one of the factors in deciding whether you should rent or own a property that you're going to live in is what's the difference in terms of the rent versus the interest that you would pay. And as the interest rates go down, it makes that story a little bit more compelling because the cost of the mortgage starts to reduce. So it is an important thing for people to consider, as if they are renting, is it time for them to move into the property market as they're able to afford to move into property. The challenge there really is to not just think about what interest rates are right now, but think about what they might be over the next 5 years and beyond. Because whilst I don't expect us to get back to the 18% interest rates that we've had in the past, you need to potentially factor in a couple of percentage points higher than what they are now.
Of course, the big question is, and the sort of thoughts that might come from an informed perspective, is that would we anticipate a low interest rate environment to continue for any length of time into the near future? Or do you think that things might be looking like interest rates could be on the rise before long?
Yeah, if you look at yields, so interest rates at the moment, the sweet spot at the moment is around the 6-month mark, and if you go beyond that, the interest rates start to drop off. So that tells us that it's not expected that interest rates will increase significantly over the longer term. There's more potential possibly at the moment for interest rates to go down a notch, but it really depends on what happens with economic indicators around the world. The Reserve Bank has got the capacity to reduce interest rates more if there are more difficult times ahead. But at the moment, it's looking reasonably flat in that the RBA is really just waiting for their cuts that they have made up to date to really filter through the system.
I think any time you talk about this debate, whether it's best to rent or to own, the focus always comes back to the renter, because the person who owns might not be thinking of selling at this point, but the person who's renting is trying to juggle this decision. What way is best for me? What about renting? Are there advantages in continuing to rent, or should you be thinking about or investigating the possibilities of owning right now?
Yeah, I guess the drawbacks of purchasing is that you're locking yourself into a particular property, and there's a high cost of entry and a high cost of exit. So if you are not sure exactly where you're wanting to buy, and that purchase might only be for a short time frame, then generally it's best to continue to rent. Because particularly in Victoria, but in other states as well, the stamp duty is quite significant on purchasing a property. And if you sell a property, you've got to pay all the real estate fees as well. So the idea of owning a property works better if you can do it for a longer term period. And generally longer term would be ideally the 3 to 5 years and beyond. And so if you're uncertain in your lifestyle and where you're going to be living and working, etc., then renting's probably the better thing. But if you know that you're going to be around or living in that property for a little while, or potentially that you can afford to lease it out if you do need to move away, then purchasing a property works well. It is ideal if you can move into a property sooner rather than later, because that actually hedges you against rapid increases in property prices. Whilst that's not particularly expected in the next few years, we can't predict the future, and it may well happen if the immigration rates continue to be at the higher end of the spectrum.
Gavin, when it comes to incentive to get into the market, and perhaps we're talking about first home buyer incentives that different state and territory governments have in place, and they would be different in different states and territories. If you see the right set of figures all lining up with your desire and your capacity to do something for the future, I guess those are things to take into consideration before making a decision on renting or owning.
Yeah, exactly. And people often ask me, is it the right time to get into the property market, thinking about, well, are prices low and should I get in? But I like to turn the question around and say, well, is it the right time for you to get into the property market? And generally that means that have you got sufficient deposit to do so? And ideally that is a 20% deposit. Now you can do less than that, but you need to factor in mortgage insurance if you do have a deposit of less than 20%. But having that 20% deposit really does enable you'd have a little bit of a buffer in terms of if the value of property does go down and you do need to sell, it means that you're not going to have an overhanging debt. But it's really important to factor in all the state-based incentives that are on the go. I know a lot of them have been reduced or eliminated, but there's still the federal government first home buyers grant of around $7,000. But if you do want to look at what's relevant for your particular state, there is a website the government has put in place which is firsthome.gov.au, and if you select your particular state, it can then direct you to the relevant incentives to purchase property. So yeah, that is well worth checking out. And the other thing for first homeowners is the First Home Savers Account, which is a great initiative of the federal government. I think it was relating to Kevin Rudd's budget promises, but it's about helping you to save a deposit for your first home and co-contributions of about 17% on what you put into that account. So that's another great initiative.
And Gavin, we've had an environment where house prices have been dropping, and then of course you have the marketing campaigns of real estate sales people that convince us that now is the time to buy because there's likely to be rising house prices. Is your thought that there is something to be fearful of if you delay, or just don't worry too much about some of the hype?
Yeah, we are sometimes with investment decisions, and house is an investment decision. We are sometimes driven by fear and greed, and I would try to avoid the thought that if I don't get in now I'm going to miss out, but do take it into consideration as well. I think if you are getting to that point where you have the sufficient deposit, it does make sense in terms of you can purchase a property that's affordable to you. It's the mortgage payments are not going to be more than 30%, or up at the higher end of the spectrum 40% of your total take-home income. That's a really good indicator. If your mortgage payments are higher than 40% of your total take-home income, then that's an indicator that it's not generally sustainable. But if you can afford it at 30% of your income, that's a really good target to work towards.
Well, it's always good insight talking on these types of issues, Gavin Martin, and just to say to listeners that this is not a professional advice session from Gavin Martin, and really everyone's finances are different. And I think if I was asking you if there was a verdict on whether this is the time to continue to rent or go out and buy a house, you've answered it by saying it depends on every individual's personal circumstances. Is this the right time for you to be pursuing home ownership? And so I'd point people to get some professional financial advice depending on their personal circumstances. Gavin, I'll point people to your website at www.cornerstonewealth.com.au. Gavin Martin, the founder of Cornerstone Wealth, thanks for being with us again today on 2020.
Yeah, fantastic to be with you, Neil.